Today you're going to learn about something that's going to optimize your growth on a day-to-day level and on a long-term scale. This is a skill that you'll cultivate, and it's sort of the skill of all skills. If you cultivate this skill, every other skill will also be cultivated. If you cultivate this skill, every other thing that you're trying to do, you will get much better at. Let's grow. Cybernetics. What is cybernetics? Here's the Wikipedia page if you want to pause it. But the summary is that it is effectively your skill of response to your environment. It's a system's ability to adapt. Now, adapting to feedback and to outside input is essentially the number one skill for growth, effectively. Cybernetics is this internal ability to collect data, process that data, and then take different action. Okay, we do that all the time. What's so special? The framework of how you think about it. Most people do this just sort of naturally, unknowingly, and they kind of do it. But when you bring it into the conscious realm, it becomes very aware that there's a way that you can sort of game this. So we do this naturally, but how often? You would be inclined to say all the time, and you would kind of be correct. However, how often do you get interrupted by something? Some sort of external stimuli happens, and instead of taking the right action, you take a bad action, such as getting angry, for example. And why is it that when you get angry, you don't immediately just stop being angry? Well, the reason why is because your cybernetic skill is low. And I'm using anger as an example here, but this applies to everything. So cybernetics is really the skill to be aware of, oh, I made a bad action, or I made a good action, and then what is the correct response in this situation? Whether it be a good action or a bad action that happened, what is the correct next response? And I'm going to give you a few responses or things you can hold within you to sort of increase your cybernetic system. So the first thing is understanding how this relates to ADHD. So when you have ADHD, you have a poor ability to self-monitor, which is one of the components of cybernetic systems, is that they are monitoring and collecting data and then responding to that feedback. So inherently, your cybernetic system kind of sucks when you have ADHD. Now that you've become aware of this, we can apply another principle of ADHD productivity and living with neurodivergency, or weakness in general, which is overcompensation. If you are bad at something, there is nothing stopping you from trying to do it at a higher volume with more creativity. When you become consciously aware of weaknesses, this is off the rip, I think that what I would call this is sort of the principle of weakness as strength, where when you have a weakness and you become aware of the weakness, you now have something to deal with. But if you deal with that weakness, then what happens is you oftentimes deal with it in a way that makes you more powerful in that area than somebody who never had that weakness to begin with. I'm going to give you an example that's going to hit close to home for some of you. So ADHD people have this high comorbidity with ADHD that is called the gifted trait. It can occur in neurotypical people as well, but it's much less likely. It's much more likely to occur in people with ADHD or autism. And I would honestly say that the majority of people with ADHD have this. What this leads to is a learning addiction because the neurons in your head basically grow faster and denser than normal people. This also leads to sensitivities and obsessions or special interests. And it means that learning feels really good. And so oftentimes people with ADHD might suck in a lot of areas, but they have a few areas where they're just utterly cracked because they're completely obsessed and you can't beat obsessed. And they have this going for them, which means that they can learn things faster. They make connections quicker. They have more novel and creative ideas because their default mode network is more active. They just kind of suck at executing on them. Now, something that is very common with gifted kids is they go through school not really having to study. Just the information that they collect from listening to things and sort of observing the world around them is oftentimes enough to let them coast through school by just acing tests. However, when you get to college, something that happens often to gifted individuals is the difficulty when they get to college is much higher than normal school, and they start to fall behind and they can't keep up. And the reason why is because they relied on their giftedness, they never had the ability, they never gained the skill of actually learning how to learn and studying how to study. After all, their giftedness was basically enough for them to get by on. And so this is an example of how a strength becomes a weakness because you didn't cultivate it, you never had to. Now when you're faced with a challenge that's great in relation to that skill, you don't have what it takes to complete it. You don't have what it takes. Whereas the person who had to struggle for it, the neurotypical who had to learn how to study, the neurotypical who had to learn how to learn, they are now better at learning than you because they put an effort that you didn't have to. And so this is an example of weakness is strength. And this is what cybernetics allows you to do. It allows you to grow in response to reality. So what I hope you got out of that is that you should probably learn how to learn and study how to study and take it seriously. But beyond that, understand that this also applies to you with your ADHD and your weaknesses. So the things that you suck at, you have to spend more time cultivating as skills. You have to spend more brain power figuring out creative solutions to deal with these problems that other people don't have. And when you do this, you become better than normal people in due time. It's not immediately, you're behind at first, but because of momentum and the fact that learning skills stack on top of each other and multiply against each other, you build more and more chemical reactions and you grow in skill in this area where other people may not have. And one example of this is there are certain overcompensations that people with ADHD develop. For example, we oftentimes have very poor organization. However, I know a few people with ADHD whose organization is cracked. They are the most organized people I know, way more organized than your average person. And the reason why is probably because at some point they realized, oh, this is going to help me overcompensate for everything else. And they saw that this was helping, so they kept stressing it and basically used it to overcompensate for the other lack of executive functions. And even though they're supposed to be bad at it, they put in so much effort and work that they became better at it than normal people. And this can happen with most of the executive functions that take a hit when you have ADHD. So tying this back into cybernetics, if our ability to self-monitor, which is one of the most important pieces of cybernetics, is compromised when you have ADHD, what that means is now that we know that, now that we're conscious of it, we can work towards making that better. And we can even stress it as more important and overcompensate. And you can do this through things like mindfulness practice, meditation. But what I'm going to teach you how to do now is something that's kind of like that, but a little bit different. And this is cybernetics. So the goal is effectively to be consciously thinking about your cybernetics throughout the day, especially when you enter into a flow state or you enter into some sort of flow. A flow is not necessarily a flow state. Flow states are like the big shiny version of a flow. So in order to develop your cybernetic skill on a day-to-day basis, what you need to do is you need to sort of think about yourself as this sort of internal nexus. And this nexus is constantly monitoring things. It's constantly assessing things. Really the most important thing is it's trying to learn, is you need to become a little bit obsessed with principles, with things that are timeless and true. And then where normal people would only really think about these things in like big life decisions, or when they're in a meditative state, you want to be thinking about these things constantly. You want to be trying to apply principles to like the smallest things and basically overcompensate everywhere. And you might say, wow, that sounds really draining. And I won't say that it's not, but it's not as draining as you think it is. And we can make it a lot nicer and even fun once you understand some of the pitfalls to avoid. So part of the cybernetic mindset focuses on always constantly being obsessed with principles and trying to apply them to the littlest things in your life. An example would be the productivity principle of consolidation, which is basically where you're always trying to bring things together. You're always trying to synthesize ideas and tasks so you can kill like 2, 3, 4 birds with one stone. This is kind of what focus looks like, and it's also what stops you from task switching. So batch working is related to this principle, because task switching has many costs associated with it. And so a normal person might only think about this principle if they hear about it every once in a while. A person with ADHD might think about it more because they kind of suck at being productive. But a person with ADHD who is applying and trying to grow their cybernetic skill might be thinking about it over the littlest things. Oh, I have 2 things of instant noodles and they need like the sauce packet to go in them. Instead of putting one in there and waiting and then putting the other one in there and waiting, I'm going to put them both in and then I'm going to wait for both and then I'm just going to do all of it at once. And how much time did this save? Probably like 10 seconds. Not very much. But that's not why you're doing it. You're doing it so that you can deeply ingrain this mindset because you're trying to overcompensate for the fact that you are less productive than a normal person. So you need this shaving of 10 seconds. Now, obviously, you shouldn't let this type of thing distract you because that is one of the pitfalls that you can fall into in cybernetics, is being so focused on the little things that you're wasting time and entropy is basically kicking your ass by lying to you and getting you to spend resources on things that are non efficient. So it's one pitfall to be aware of. Another part of cybernetics is effectively understanding that emotions are not your friend. So when you have ADHD, you are more sensitive. Oftentimes that gifted trait plays a part in that. But just in general, because of how our dopamine works, we are just more sensitive in general, especially to rejection and demands. We don't like demands. That's called demand avoidance. And because emotions are stimulating, we are oftentimes emotional. Like we oftentimes get put into a downward or upward spiral because we're emotional. But the thing about emotions is they're not good for making decisions. They're effectively bad for cybernetics. And what they cause you to do is to get distracted and to focus on things that are kind of nonsensical and childish. And this is very draining. This is very taxing when you're running through imaginary scenarios in your head that have nothing to do with anything. And the only reason you're doing it is because they're giving you emotional stimulation. And the thing to understand about flow and flow states is that the cleaner, the more pure, the higher grade of a flow state you're in, the less you're thinking. So a good flow state has maybe some thoughts, a great flow state has barely any thoughts, and a really good flow state has no thoughts. You're effectively just like this machine that's responding to everything that you see. There isn't a thought going through your mind. And this feels so good. This is pure bliss. It's like a surge of dopamine that's just carrying you and it feels like the wind is at your back. It's the best feeling ever. And emotions cause you to make poor decisions, whether they're positive or negative emotions, they're going to cause you to make poor decisions because you're going to be impulsive and you're not going to be able to evaluate things clearly because you're too emotionally involved. And so this is one of the principles of cybernetics, is that emotions are not your friend. And when you internally see, oh, I'm feeling an emotion, but I'm working. It's not that emotions are bad. It's just that they're not appropriate for work more often than not. And that may not always be true. Maybe it just sort of depends on the task. But as a general rule of thumb, emotions are not good for work. And so part of cybernetics is, so when you see, oh, I'm becoming emotional, you immediately self-correct and try to bring yourself back to stillness and back to non-emotionality. Now, I actually find that the best thing for this is having like a slight undercurrent of sort of like a victorious emotion where it's like pressing forth, but only slight. And the other aspect is basically just being obsessed with learning and using like every little single piece of data to try and learn something about reality or about yourself or about what's going on. And another thing you can do is when you learn something, instead of just being like, okay, that's cool, and then moving on to the next thing, you can try to log it in your mind by like replaying it, hitting it from a few different angles, and maybe saying out loud, this is how this works, or this is what happened when I did this. I'm not going to do it this way anymore, and this is what I will do instead. When you say things out loud, they basically have more of a chance to get logged into your brain because the information is being stored in more places in your brain. And since we know that we are very forgetful as people with ADHD, this is another thing we want to overcompensate for, is the recording ability. And so one of the big things to avoid in cybernetics, or one of the biggest things, is just figuring out what is drains. You're always thinking about, is this useful? What is the ROI on this? This action that I'm doing, or this thing that I'm thinking about, or this emotion that I'm feeling. And again, don't suppress your emotions, just return back to center. Cybernetics is all about seeing things, acknowledging them, and then pivoting. You're never trying to push something away or not be acknowledging of it. You're always just re-pivoting back to the target. And that's focus. And in cybernetics, the focus is growth. of all kinds. If you take this seriously, if you try and overcompensate in the realm of cybernetics, you are going to grow faster than normal people eventually. It takes time to cultivate this. And part of cybernetics is realizing when you've stopped doing this practice for a long time and just getting back on the horse. In fact, this is a principle with ADHD productivity. You're going to get off track. You cannot be aware 24/7. You have a hyperactive default mode network that's unrealistic. But if you care more about getting back on track than normal people, you'll eventually get better at that than normal people, where you'll at least be able to overcompensate and off-put for some of your weaknesses. The other thing to keep in mind is that your strengths are real and you need to play to them. That's important for growth. It's not always about trying to overcompensate for your weaknesses, but this is one tactic that does work. So when you see that you have a chance to capitalize on a strength, capitalize on it. Cybernetics is not being full throttle all the time. Cybernetics is trying to strengthen your awareness and your ability to respond, make decisions, and learn in the moment. And it is a muscle that you can grow. And if you actually care about growing this muscle, you can overcompensate for your disability a little bit. In fact, you may even be able to beat other people at things because they would never even apply this skill to whatever they're going through. Thank you guys so much for coming to my TED Talk. If you would like a consistent source of growth that is specific to ADHD and your productivity and living the life that you want, then go ahead and subscribe to my channel. If you would like this video to be pushed out to more people, go ahead and like it if you liked it, and go ahead and comment down below an example of a way that you've been sort of cybernetic in the past, or maybe something you do every day. Thank you guys so much for watching. See you in the next video. Peace.